It is often the smallest, most picturesque towns that carry the heaviest shadows. At first glance, this place seemed nothing short of idyllic. Nestled between rolling hills and fields that glowed golden in the evening sun, the town projected an image straight out of a postcard. Neatly painted homes lined quiet streets, their front porches adorned with rocking chairs and flower boxes that bloomed in every season. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, greeting their neighbors by name. Local shops still rang up purchases by hand, the owners knowing not just their customers' faces but their family histories. Outsiders who passed through often marveled at how time seemed to move slower here, as if untouched by the chaos of the modern world. To many, it was the definition of safety, of warmth, of home. The story always began with the same description: perfect. The perfect place to raise a family. The perfect escape from the noise of the city. The perfect embodiment of American small-town charm. It was so perfect, in fact, that people rarely asked deeper questions. No one wondered how a town could maintain such harmony across decades when so many others had been rattled by crime, by scandal, by tragedy. No one paused to notice that the quiet was perhaps a little too still, the smiles a little too rehearsed, the reputation a little too guarded. Like a painting hanging on the wall, the surface dazzled the eye, but if you pressed your fingers to the canvas, you might feel the cracks beneath the layers of paint. There were stories, of course, the kind that most dismissed as folklore. A whisper carried down from grandparents to grandchildren, a warning told around campfires, strange anecdotes half remembered and quickly laughed off. The residents themselves seemed to laugh too quickly when questioned about them. It was easier, after all, to keep the narrative polished. Easier to maintain the illusion of perfection than to acknowledge that something darker might lurk beneath the manicured lawns and the polite greetings. Visitors never stayed long enough to notice the hesitations. They came, they admired, they left. And the town remained, as carefully preserved as a secret too terrible to tell. The longer one looked, the more it began to feel uncanny. Not a single crime seemed to mar the official records. Local papers carried cheerful headlines about school plays, fundraisers, and parades, rarely mentioning anything unpleasant. Generations passed, each one leaving behind smiling yearbook photos and neatly documented family histories, as though the town had never known grief. Yet any community that claims such flawlessness raises suspicion, because perfection is not a natural state, it is a performance. A mask, worn so consistently that even those behind it forget the weight of their own disguise. To walk through the town at night was to feel a different presence. The streets, empty after sundown, held a silence that pressed against the ears. The warm colors of daylight were replaced by shadows that seemed to stretch too far, lingering at the edges of the lamplight. If you stood still long enough, you might hear the faint echo of something unspoken, not the hum of traffic or the laughter of neighbors, but something buried deeper. An echo of absence, as if the town itself remembered more than it allowed anyone to admit. And yet, this image of charm and safety persisted for nearly a century. Real estate brochures praised it as a haven. Travel magazines wrote glowing features. The people who lived here prided themselves on their heritage, their traditions, their apparent immunity to the ugliness of the outside world. They boasted of doors left unlocked, of children walking to school without fear, of generations born and raised without disruption. Theirs was a story of continuity, of peace. At least, that was the story told to outsiders, the story they needed everyone else to believe. But history has a way of surfacing, even when buried. Small details resisted erasure, an incomplete record, a missing photograph, a funeral whispered about but never fully explained. Each anomaly might have been dismissed on its own, but together they formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. And those who looked too closely, those who asked too many questions, found themselves regarded with a discomfort that bordered on hostility. The townspeople were polite, always polite, but their eyes carried a warning: don't dig too deep. Don't disturb what has been carefully laid to rest. It is in these contradictions, the surface of tranquility, the undercurrent of unease, that the real story begins. Because the perfect town was never truly perfect. Its beauty, its order, its timeless charm, all served a purpose: to protect something. To shield a truth so dark, so corrosive, that acknowledging it would unravel not just the image of the town but the very foundations of its history. And so, the mask remained in place. Generations passed beneath its gaze, each inheriting the silence of the one before. The secret lay dormant, waiting, as graves lay beneath the earth, unseen but not gone. For 100 years, this town guarded its deadliest truth. And for 100 years, the world believed its illusion. But illusions do not last forever. Sooner or later, light finds its way into the cracks. And when it does, the shadows that emerge are far more terrifying than the darkness that came before. Because behind every perfect smile, there is something unspoken. Behind every perfect street, there is a story untold. And behind this perfect town, there was something far worse than anyone dared imagine. This is not just the story of a town. It is the story of what happens when silence is inherited, when secrets are buried not for years, but for generations. It is a story of the weight of complicity, the fragility of facades, and the terrible price of maintaining perfection at any cost. And it begins, as all stories do, with the illusion of safety, the illusion of purity, the illusion of a town untouched by darkness. But illusions crack. And this one was about to shatter. The past does not always speak in full sentences. Sometimes it murmurs, faintly, in fragments carried through generations. In this town, the whispers were never loud enough to draw outsiders' attention, yet never quiet enough to completely disappear. A curious child might overhear their grandparents mention the time when people vanished. An elderly neighbor might shake her head at the mention of certain fields, muttering that no one should walk there after dark. But whenever questions were asked, the answers were evasive, cut short with a laugh, or softened with the phrase, "That was long ago." For decades, these fragments were dismissed as nothing more than folklore. Every town has its ghost stories, its legends told to frighten children into obedience. Parents sometimes invoke the disappearances as a warning: come home before dark, or you'll end up like those who wandered off long ago. Teenagers whispered about hidden cellars and cursed houses, daring each other to spend the night near them. Outsiders who happened to hear such stories assumed it was local color, no different from tales of haunted barns or mysterious lights in the sky. But what set these whispers apart was their persistence. They never faded with time. Instead, they seemed woven into the fabric of the town itself, surviving each passing generation. One of the earliest stories concerned a man named Elias, a farmhand who supposedly vanished while walking home from work one summer evening. The tale was told in fragments: his dinner still waiting on the table, his tools laid neatly by the barn, his boots found near the edge of the woods, but no trace of Elias himself. The official explanation was that he left for a better life elsewhere. Yet the locals told it differently. They said he was taken, and that his disappearance was only the first. Then there was the family that seemed to vanish overnight, their home left untouched, food spoiling on the stove, their belongings still in place. The house stood empty for years, whispered about by schoolchildren who dared each other to step inside. The records claimed the family had relocated, but neighbors swore they had heard screams the night before they were gone. When pressed for details, those who had lived closest suddenly grew quiet, as though the memory itself was too dangerous to recall. These stories were not isolated. They echoed across decades: workers who never returned from night shifts, travelers who stopped in town and were never seen again, children who wandered into the woods and never emerged. And while every small community has its share of tragedy, the sheer number of odd disappearances began to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. The unsettling part was the way these stories were treated. The town's elders spoke of them only in hushed tones, and always with an urgency that suggested warning rather than entertainment. There was no gleeful storytelling, no exaggeration for effect. Instead, there was an underlying fear, as if saying too much might invite the same fate. These were not ghost stories told for fun. They were cautions wrapped in silence. A few curious individuals tried to chase the whispers back to their origins. Old letters were searched, faded diaries uncovered, church records examined. In the margins of these documents, peculiar notes appeared, sudden mentions of absence, funerals with no bodies, names crossed out without explanation. More than once, a researcher found entire pages torn out, as though someone had deliberately removed uncomfortable details. The deeper they searched, the more irregularities they uncovered. Birth records didn't match census lists. Family trees ended abruptly. Gravestones stood with names chiseled away. What unsettled people most was how these anomalies were never explained, only covered over with increasingly thin excuses. Officials dismissed questions with a shrug. People move, they'd say. Families relocate. Records are never perfect. But in a town that prided itself on knowing every face, every name, every generation, the idea of so many lives simply slipping away rang hollow. The whispers extended beyond documents. Certain places in town seemed to carry an unspoken dread. Children were warned not to play in a particular meadow. Locals avoided an old well at the edge of town, claiming it was bad luck to go near it. Some roads, though perfectly functional, were rarely used, avoided without clear reason. Ask anyone why, and they would offer vague excuses: the soil isn't safe there, or it's just tradition. Yet their eyes betrayed something deeper, a memory not put into words. Every generation carried fragments of the past forward, though no one seemed willing to gather the fragments into a full picture. And perhaps that was the point. The stories worked best as fragments. Broken apart, they remained deniable, easy to dismiss. But placed together, they began to form something far more troubling. A visiting historian once wrote that the town carried an unsettling neatness, that its history was too pristine, too carefully preserved. At the time, his words drew little attention. Yet locals remembered how quickly his research came to an end, his departure unannounced. It was said he left suddenly, abandoning his rented home without a word. Some believed he had been frightened away. Others whispered he had joined the list of names that never came back. The unsettling truth was that no one could pinpoint where rumor ended and reality began. Were these vanishings exaggerations of ordinary tragedies? Or were they the scattered clues of something much darker? The whispers refused to settle into clarity. They remained as they had always been, fragments carried on the wind, woven into lullabies, into warnings, into the quiet spaces between conversations. And so, the town's perfect image remained untouched in the public eye. Outsiders continued to see charm and beauty. But those who lived within the boundaries knew better, even if they never admitted it aloud. They knew that their streets held memories too heavy to name, that behind every cheerful festival and tidy home was a history filled with absence. The whispers persisted because the truth had never been spoken. And the longer it went unspoken, the stronger the whispers became. Because whispers are not harmless. They are echoes of something waiting. They remind us that the past does not vanish simply because we choose to silence it. And here, in this town that prided itself on perfection, the whispers were telling anyone willing to listen that perfection was a lie. The question was, were these stories only shadows of the imagination? Or were they fragments of a truth deliberately buried, a truth the town would do anything to keep hidden? The whispers became flesh in the form of names. For so long, the stories of disappearances had felt like folklore, faceless shadows from an indistinct past. But once you looked into the records, once you found the fragments that had escaped erasure, the faces began to emerge. They were not myths. They were men, women, and children who had lived ordinary lives in the town, and then, without warning, had ceased to exist. The first documented case that rose above rumor was that of Elias Harrow, the farmhand spoken of in passing by older generations. Elias was 24 years old in the summer of 1903. He was known as a quiet but good-natured man, someone who labored long hours in the fields yet still found time to help his neighbors with repairs and chores. He lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, a short walk from the fields where he worked. On the night of June 18, he was expected at supper in the farmhouse of his employer, as he often was. The food was set, his chair waiting, but Elias never arrived. At first, no one panicked. It wasn't unusual for a young man to wander off, to spend the evening in town or at the tavern. But the next morning, when his tools were found carefully placed by the barn and his boots discovered near the edge of the woods, concern began to stir. A search was organized, lanterns combing through the fields and the tree line. Days passed. No sign of Elias emerged. The official record stated that he had likely sought work in another town. His meager belongings were collected and auctioned off. But those who knew him best doubted that explanation. Elias was reliable, rooted, not the sort to leave suddenly without a word. His disappearance was the first fracture in the town's perfect image. Then there was the Whitford family, whose vanishing shocked the community in 1911. Samuel and Margaret Whitford were not wealthy, but they were respected, steady members of the town. They had 3 children, Anna, age 10, James, age 7, and Clara, just 5 years old. Their farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by apple orchards that Samuel tended with pride. Neighbors recalled hearing laughter from the orchard on summer evenings, Margaret singing drifting from the kitchen window. And then, one autumn morning, the Whitford house was silent. A visiting cousin discovered the eerie scene. The table was set for breakfast, bowls of porridge untouched, steam long gone. Samuel's coat hung on its usual peg by the door. Margaret's knitting sat half-finished on a chair. The children's toys were scattered across the floor. But the family themselves were gone, as if plucked out of existence. Livestock roamed untended in the fields. Weeks of searching turned up nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, no clues at all. The official explanation echoed the familiar refrain, the Whitfords had moved suddenly. But their relatives received no word, and no new residence was ever discovered. Their absence lingered, heavy and unresolved. The Whitfords were not the last. In the decades that followed, the pattern became harder to ignore. Names appeared in church registers and then ended abruptly, without funerals. Census records listed households that were mysteriously smaller than they should have been. A young seamstress named Mary Ellis, known for her skill in making gowns for nearly every wedding in town, simply stopped showing up for work in 1922. Her employer claimed she had run off with a lover. Yet her savings remained untouched, her possessions still neatly folded in her rented room. The women who had depended on her work whispered otherwise, that Mary had been seen walking home late one evening, and that no one ever saw her again. The strangest detail across these disappearances was the lack of alarm. Families mourned quietly, but there were no large investigations, no uproar, no collective demand for answers. Each case seemed to vanish into silence almost as quickly as the person themselves. The local newspaper printed cheerful stories about town fairs and harvest festivals, while the missing were mentioned only in brief, sterile notices. It was as if the town had made an unspoken agreement: do not dwell, do not question, do not disrupt the illusion. And yet, the traces remained. Diaries written by children mentioned classmates who didn't come back to school. Letters sent to relatives referenced neighbors who had gone missing, but no one talks about it. One entry, written by a teenage girl in 1934, read simply, "I'm afraid. They say not to ask. They say people leave, but I know they don't. I don't want to be the next one." What made these vanishings even more chilling was the way they seemed to strike without pattern. A farmhand, a family, a seamstress, a child, none shared the same background or circumstances. The randomness gave the impression that no one was safe. And yet, paradoxically, the rest of the town carried on as though nothing were wrong. Weddings were celebrated, businesses thrived, festivals continued. The disappearances existed like shadows at the edges of photographs, never acknowledged, yet always present. For those who dared to look closely, the official explanations rang hollow. Why would Elias leave behind his boots? Why would the Whitfords abandon a hot breakfast, their livestock, their entire livelihood? Why would Mary Ellis walk away from the clients who adored her, from the community that relied on her craft? The more questions one asked, the more the silence grew suffocating. Decades later, descendants of the missing would attempt to trace their ancestors' fates. Some filed inquiries with state archives, others searched old cemeteries for unmarked graves. Occasionally, a clue would surface, a photograph with a face scratched out, a ledger with names struck through, a letter hastily cut short. But never enough to tell the full story. It was as though the town itself had conspired to bury the truth, scattering the fragments so that no one could piece them together. The weight of these disappearances was not just in the loss of lives, but in the loss of memory. Entire generations grew up never knowing why their family trees had gaps, why certain names were never spoken. The missing became ghosts not only of flesh, but of history. They lingered in silence, erased yet never forgotten, haunting the town with every unspoken question. And as the number of vanishings grew, so too did the unease. Because for every person who disappeared, there was a convenient explanation. Always neat, always plausible enough to pass. But sometimes, explanations that are too convenient are not explanations at all. They are cover stories. They are lies designed to mask something far darker than the truth they replace. The town's silence was no longer just eerie. It was suspicious. And the question that whispered louder with every disappearance was simple: what, or who, was the town protecting? By the time the disappearances had multiplied into a pattern, the town should have been in uproar. Elsewhere, such vanishing acts would have sparked headlines, lawmen swarming the streets, perhaps even intervention from state authorities. Yet here, in this town so committed to its perfect image, the response was strangely muted. The investigations, such as they were, seemed designed less to uncover the truth and more to provide the appearance of effort, a ritual of inquiry that always ended in silence. When Elias Harrow disappeared, the local constable noted the missing boots, the untouched cabin, the sudden absence of a man known for reliability. But his official report told a different story. Elias had likely departed in search of better wages. The few witnesses who raised doubts, neighbors who insisted Elias had made no plans to leave, found their statements reduced to footnotes, their words framed as mere speculation. The file was closed within a week. The Whitfords' case followed the same script. Their vanished breakfast, their abandoned farm, their children's toys left scattered on the floor, all the details that screamed of sudden rupture were swept aside. The official line declared that the family had moved west to join relatives. When those supposed relatives denied it, their denial never entered the records. Instead, the Whitfords were listed as relocated, their disappearance neatly filed away under paperwork that no one outside the town would question. Again and again, the same pattern repeated. A young seamstress gone without warning. Run away with a lover. A child never seen after walking home from school. Likely sent to live with family elsewhere. A traveling salesman who stopped in town and never made it to his next destination. Perhaps changed his route. Each explanation was simple, plausible, and impossible to disprove. And each bore the same unsettling mark, a refusal to look deeper. The townspeople noticed, of course. How could they not? But they also noticed what happened to those who pressed too hard. In 1927, a schoolteacher named Robert Crane began to keep his own log of disappearances. He clipped articles, saved notes, wrote down every irregularity he found. His colleagues said he grew pale and distracted, whispering to trusted friends that something terribly wrong was being hidden. One spring morning, he failed to appear for class. His journal of clippings was discovered half-burned in his fireplace. The official explanation? He had decided to pursue opportunities elsewhere. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. Journalists occasionally sniffed around, lured by the faint trail of rumors that reached beyond the town's borders. One reporter, a woman named Helen McCarthy from a regional paper, came in 1935 to investigate the Whitford family's disappearance. She interviewed neighbors, asked uncomfortable questions at the town hall, and was last seen boarding a carriage for the train station. she never arrived at her destination. Her editor received a telegram, unsigned, stating that she had abandoned her post. Her notes were never found. The deeper one looks into the history of these so-called investigations, the clearer the pattern of suppression becomes. Records are missing entire sections. Coroner's reports from certain years have vanished from archives. Death certificates contain vague causes like unknown or natural causes, written in the same looping hand across multiple decades. When descendants of the missing sought information, they found files mysteriously misplaced, requests lost in bureaucratic voids. It was as if the paper trail itself had been deliberately pruned, leaving only the thinnest branches to suggest nothing unusual had ever occurred. But the most telling sign of all was the silence of the authorities themselves. The constables, the councilmen, the town leaders, men who should have been the loudest voices calling for justice, seemed always eager to quiet concerns. They reminded citizens that every town has its tragedies, that people leave for reasons unknown. They urged the community to focus on the present, on the blessings of safety and prosperity. To question the disappearances was to invite suspicion, to risk being branded as a troublemaker. Fear crept in like a slow poison. Neighbors stopped talking openly about the missing. Families who had lost loved ones mourned in private, careful not to draw too much attention. The more vanishings occurred, the more the silence thickened, until it became part of the town's very identity. Here, people did not ask why. They accepted what they were told, because not accepting it carried risks. There were, however, always a few who refused to be silenced. A minister once preached a fiery sermon in the 1940s, condemning the sins buried beneath our streets. His congregation listened in stunned silence. The next week, he was reassigned to a distant parish, his departure explained as a personal calling. A doctor who treated a victim's family confided to his diary that he believed foul play was at work. Weeks later, his practice was mysteriously shut down, his license revoked under vague accusations. His diary pages beyond that entry were torn out. It became clear over time that the town did not merely fail to investigate, it actively prevented investigations from taking root. Each attempt to shine a light was swiftly extinguished, each voice that rose above the silence was pushed back down. Whether through intimidation, exile, or sudden disappearance, the result was always the same: the perfect town remained untarnished in the public eye. And yet, as thorough as the suppression was, it left its own kind of evidence. The gaps in the records, the sudden relocations of investigators, the convenient explanations repeated like a script, all of it formed a shadow history, an absence that told its own story. Absence, after all, is a kind of presence. What is missing speaks just as loudly as what remains. The citizens learned to live within that shadow. They told themselves that the authorities knew best, that the vanishings were unfortunate but unremarkable, that nothing truly sinister could exist in a place so beautiful, so safe. But deep down, many knew the truth: there had been no real investigations. Only performances, staged to keep the town's mask intact. And masks are not worn without reason. Someone, or something, needed the truth hidden. Someone had the power to silence questions, to erase records, to keep entire families from ever being spoken of again. The question was no longer whether disappearances had happened. The evidence, fragmented though it was, proved that much. The real question was why the town worked so hard to bury the truth. And the answer to that question would prove far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. If the investigations were hollow, the prosperity was anything but. The town thrived in ways that seemed almost impossible given its modest size and remote location. Businesses flourished, harvests exceeded expectations, and the local mills produced enough to outcompete larger neighbors. Visitors marveled at the neat streets, the orderly homes, and the air of confidence that seemed to hang over every transaction. The town was, to outward eyes, a miracle of stability and growth. But beneath that outward success lay a truth that few spoke aloud: prosperity was not evenly shared. Certain families always seemed to rise above the rest. Their farms yielded more than others. Their businesses never failed, even when competitors collapsed. Their children received the best education, moved seamlessly into leadership positions, and returned home with resources that bolstered the family line. From generation to generation, the same surnames appeared at the head of committees, on the deeds of the largest properties, and in the rosters of the wealthiest donors. The Harrows, the Whitfords, the Cranes, and a handful of others formed the spine of this prosperity. Though some branches of these families met grim fates, like Elias Harrow or the Whitfords who vanished without a trace, other branches seemed untouchable, immune to the randomness that afflicted lesser citizens. Over time, townspeople began to whisper that the disappearances and the prosperity were connected, that what was taken from some somehow ensured the flourishing of others. Historical records show that this pattern dates back to the town's founding. In the late 1800s, when settlers first staked their claim here, survival was precarious. Crops failed, winters were brutal, and disease swept through households. Yet in the midst of such hardship, a core group of families prospered. They acquired land abandoned by those who could no longer endure. They secured rights to the river, monopolizing the mills and controlling trade. They built alliances through marriage, consolidating wealth while others starved. And then came the vanishings. The earliest records, faint pencil notations in the town ledger, mention missing household beside the names of entire families. No cause, no explanation, just an absence noted and their property swiftly transferred to neighbors who, curiously, belonged to the surviving elite families. These absences coincided with sudden bursts of prosperity, a barn rebuilt, a mill expanded, a shipment of goods sent farther than ever before. Misfortune, it seemed, always cleared the way for someone else's success. By the turn of the 20th century, the cycle was firmly established. The town's reputation for success grew, while its undercurrent of disappearances remained hidden behind polite silence. The families who thrived took on roles of civic responsibility, councilmen, church elders, business leaders. They insisted that their wealth came from hard work, good faith, and divine blessing. And yet, behind closed doors, the question lingered, why did their fortunes rise each time others were swallowed by misfortune? The suspicion deepened when outsiders tried to join the town's success. New arrivals sometimes purchased modest farms or opened shops, only to encounter sudden catastrophe. A barn fire would consume a year's harvest. An inexplicable illness would sweep through a household. Or worse, the family themselves would vanish, their property quietly absorbed into the holdings of the established elite. It was as though the prosperity of the chosen could not tolerate competition. One particular incident in 1912 stood out. A family named the Pattersons arrived, determined and ambitious, intent on building a dairy business to rival the long-standing Crane family enterprise. They invested heavily, hired workers, and for a brief time seemed poised to succeed. Then, one summer, their herd died overnight under mysterious circumstances. A few weeks later, the Pattersons themselves disappeared. Their farm, purchased at auction, went directly into Crane hands. The official story suggested they had moved west in search of better luck, but locals who had seen the empty house knew better. Such stories circulated in whispers, but the official narrative remained untouched. The town grew wealthier, its core families more entrenched, their grip on power unshakable. Even as industries elsewhere faltered during the Great Depression, the town seemed oddly immune. Its mills kept running, its businesses stayed solvent, and while hunger and poverty ravaged neighboring communities, this place endured with minimal suffering. Prosperity, again, paired with silence. Generations passed, and the surnames of influence remained largely unchanged. The Harrows, despite losing Elias, maintained their position. The Cranes grew into something resembling a dynasty, their wealth multiplying even as whispers followed them. The Whitfords, curiously, never entirely disappeared, despite the infamous vanishing of one branch, other branches thrived, almost as if that loss had secured their survival. Each tragedy seemed to sharpen the dominance of those who remained. The townspeople, caught between admiration and unease, found themselves dependent on the elite. They borrowed from their banks, worked in their mills, attended schools funded by their donations. To question them was unthinkable, not just because of their power, but because of the fear that lingered in the air. Everyone knew that those who pushed too hard sometimes joined the ranks of the missing. What emerged, then, was a chilling unspoken rule: prosperity was purchased, not earned. Each vanishing carved space for someone else's success. Each loss became a gain, redistributed upward to those already in power. The disappearances were not random tragedies but a mechanism, one that no official document would ever admit, but that everyone in town, deep down, understood. The most disturbing part was how normalized it became. Children grew up hearing their parents caution them, "Don't ask too many questions, keep to your place, the town takes care of its own." Prosperity was framed as a blessing, and blessings, people were told, required sacrifice. Whether that sacrifice was voluntary or forced was never discussed. By the mid-20th century, the system had hardened into tradition. The same families ran the town, the same gaps appeared in records, the same silent exchanges of misfortune and fortune continued. Outsiders still marveled at the town's stability, but insiders knew the truth. Every new building, every prosperous season, every banner proclaiming civic pride carried with it a hidden cost, a life, a family, an absence that no one dared to name. And so the town's foundations were not merely built on soil and stone, but on something far darker, a cycle of disappearance that preserved the power of a chosen few. Every prosperous town builds its traditions. There are parades to honor founding days, ceremonies to mark the harvest, and solemn church services to unite a community in faith. Outwardly, this town was no different. Outsiders who attended its festivals described them as quaint and wholesome, children carrying lanterns, choirs singing beneath banners, townsfolk gathering in unity. Yet beneath the familiar rituals of small-town life, there was something slightly off. The first unsettling detail lay in the timing. The festivals were not always aligned with national holidays or church calendars. Instead, they were anchored to peculiar dates: a week when no planting was done though the soil was ripe, a night when businesses shuttered early despite no official occasion. Residents called these events old traditions, and brushed away questions, but their timing often coincided with the very periods when disappearances were whispered to have occurred. Take, for instance, the midsummer gathering. At dusk, families carried offerings of bread and fruit to the edge of town, where they left the food in silence before returning home. When asked, they claimed it was a custom of Thanksgiving, a gesture to honor the land and its bounty. But older residents remembered a different explanation whispered to them as children: the offerings were meant to keep unwanted forces satisfied, so they would not take more. Church records added another layer of unease. Early sermons delivered by the town's first ministers contained curious passages about sacrifice, cleansing, and the dangers of selfish survival. Though framed in biblical language, the emphasis felt distorted. Scholars later noted that entire sections of the church's archives had been deliberately destroyed in a fire, leaving only fragments. Among those fragments was a chilling handwritten note in the margin of a sermon: "The balance must be kept." One for many. Oral folklore from the town's elders echoed this sentiment. Some recalled hearing lullabies that seemed less like children's songs and more like veiled warnings. One verse, remembered by several sources, spoke of "the night the fields will choose," urging children to stay close to home when the winds turned. These fragments may have been poetic relics of agrarian fears, or they may have been coded acknowledgments of something much darker. Certain physical sites in the town reinforced this eerie undercurrent. The old well, avoided by nearly everyone, was the subject of particular suspicion. Though it had been sealed decades earlier, residents swore they heard strange echoes rising from its depths at night. Others spoke of a circle of stones hidden deep in the woods, a place where no vegetation grew, and where animals avoided grazing. Teenagers daring enough to visit reported an overwhelming sense of dread, as though they were being watched. Local folklore tied these sites to the disappearances. According to whispers, the well was where the voices lingered, while the stone circle was where choices were made. Neither phrase was explained clearly, but both hinted at rituals carried out in secret. Some claimed families had been forced to draw lots when times grew desperate, choosing who among them would be given, so the rest might live. Whether this was metaphor, exaggeration, or literal truth remained shrouded in silence. What gave the folklore weight was how persistently it threaded through every generation. While official documents scrubbed the disappearances into bland phrases like relocated or absent, the oral stories never died. Children still whispered about the well. Elders still warned against the stones. And though the modern town embraced its image of prosperity and perfection, these shadows lingered in its collective memory. By the mid-20th century, when academics began studying rural folklore, researchers who visited this town found something deeply troubling. Unlike other communities where ghost stories had playful tones, here the tales carried a solemn, almost reverent weight. One anthropologist wrote in his journal, "I sense in their voices not the joy of storytelling but the burden of remembrance." He noted that whenever he pressed for details, conversations ended abruptly, as though he had stepped into forbidden territory. Another peculiarity emerged in the form of recurring symbols. Old quilts, weathered gravestones, and even carvings on barns bore a motif of interlocking circles. Some dismissed it as a decorative pattern, but others believed it represented a cycle, a closed system that required maintenance. One folklorist suggested it symbolized the exchange whispered about in so many fragments, a life given so that others might flourish. Religion complicated matters further. Though the town's church outwardly practiced mainstream Christianity, its sermons often emphasized themes rarely heard elsewhere: collective sacrifice, the sin of questioning divine order, and the idea that the community is preserved through the few. Some parishioners insisted these were metaphorical teachings, but others admitted in hushed tones that the sermons reflected something older, something carried from the town's founding. And then there were the festivals. Visitors sometimes remarked on the odd silence that accompanied certain rituals. One local custom involved extinguishing all lights at midnight, plunging the town into complete darkness for several minutes. Outsiders found it strange, even unnerving, but locals explained it as a time of reflection. What they did not explain was why the custom coincided with the anniversaries of documented disappearances, as though the blackout was a form of acknowledgement, a quiet tribute to those lost. The overlap of folklore, ritual, and religion created a suffocating effect. It was impossible to tell where superstition ended and deliberate practice began. Were the offerings of bread simple tokens of gratitude, or remnants of appeasement? Were the sermons about sacrifice theological metaphors, or coded justifications? And, most chillingly, were the vanishings isolated tragedies, or the direct result of rituals woven into the town's very foundations? Residents maintained a strange balance. They carried on their public lives with smiles, traditions, and pride. Yet in private, they carried stories heavy with fear. Many believed the town itself demanded something, not necessarily a god, not necessarily the devil, but a force tied to the land, to its prosperity, to the cycle that never seemed to break. As one elderly woman once whispered to a visiting journalist, "We don't talk about it because talking feeds it." The town knows what it takes, and it always takes just enough to keep going. Those words lingered, unanswered, leaving behind the chilling thought: prosperity may have been less a blessing than a bargain. And bargains, especially those struck in silence, are rarely without consequence. Because the truth gnawed at the edges of every ritual, every whispered story, every darkened festival night. If the town's success was purchased, what exactly had been the currency? And how many more payments would be required before the debt was finally considered paid? The silence might have lasted forever had it not been for outsiders. By the late 20th century, when history departments grew more curious about overlooked communities, and when true crime journalism was beginning to thrive, the town attracted the wrong kind of attention. Its reputation for flawless prosperity, paired with faint echoes of disappearance rumors, was too peculiar to ignore. The first to arrive was a young graduate student named Martin Hale in 1978. He intended to write his thesis on rural prosperity in isolated American communities. At first, locals welcomed him. They smiled politely, shared census figures, and pointed him toward the library's neat collection of town records. But as Hale dug deeper, he began to notice the gaps. Decades where population totals fluctuated without explanation. Property deeds that shifted ownership in silence. Obituaries missing bodies. In his notes, later recovered by his family, Hale described a pattern that disturbed him: for every documented gain, there is an undocumented absence. The town grows by subtraction. His letters home grew increasingly uneasy. He mentioned residents who smiled too tightly, neighbors who seemed to watch him from across the street, and a librarian who whispered, "Some questions shouldn't be asked here." Then, in the spring of 1979, Hale vanished. Official reports claimed he left to pursue work overseas. But his family never received confirmation. His bank accounts were untouched, and his thesis draft, meticulously outlined but unfinished, remained locked in his university desk. Among his belongings was a single scrap of paper with 3 words written in shaky handwriting: "The circle holds." Hale's disappearance might have ended the inquiry, but a decade later, a local newspaper journalist named Sandra Lewis stumbled across his case while researching abandoned academic projects. Intrigued, she began looking into the town herself. Unlike Hale, Lewis was older, shrewder, and experienced in navigating hostile communities. She arrived under the guise of writing a human interest piece about the happiest town in America. At first, the surface charmed her. Cheerful shopkeepers, tidy homes, and an almost unnerving sense of order. But beneath the surface, she too noticed the cracks. Families refused to talk about relatives who had moved away. Death records listed causes as vague as "gone missing." School yearbooks contained photos of students who, locals insisted, had never existed. One evening, while interviewing an elderly resident, Lewis was told something she would never forget. The woman, frail and trembling, whispered, "Don't let them see you ask. The town needs to keep taking. That's how it survives." Before Lewis could press further, the woman's daughter stormed into the room and ended the interview abruptly. The next day, the family denied ever speaking to her. Lewis returned home with her notes, intending to publish a feature. But before she could, her editor received an anonymous warning letter: "Stop digging into our town. Some stories should stay buried." The letter contained details of Lewis's private life that were never public: her home address, her family's names, even the route she drove to work. Terrified, Lewis abandoned the project. Years later, in interviews, she admitted, "It was the only time in my career I felt I'd crossed into something I wasn't meant to survive." Despite her silence, whispers of the town's secrets spread through journalist circles. By the early 2000s, the age of internet forums and amateur sleuthing brought a new wave of attention. Message boards dedicated to unsolved mysteries began trading rumors of the town that erases its people. Anonymous users shared scans of redacted documents, photographs of faded gravestones, and tales of travelers who entered the town and never came back. One particularly chilling post came from a truck driver who claimed to have delivered goods there in 2004. He described the eerie perfection of the town, but noted that every streetlight went out at midnight, all at once, like a signal. When he asked locals why, they simply told him, "It's tradition. Best not to question it." The driver never returned to the forum. His account went silent, his email bouncing back within months. By now, a pattern had become clear: those who pried too deeply risked becoming part of the silence. The town was not violent in any obvious sense. There were no open threats, no visible crimes. Instead, there was a suffocating presence, a weight of fear that pressed down on outsiders until they fled, or disappeared. And yet, each attempt left behind fragments. Hale's notes, Lewis's interviews, forum posts, photographs. Individually, they were inconclusive. Together, they painted a picture of something carefully maintained. A place where prosperity was purchased in silence, where rituals persisted in shadows, and where anyone who sought truth risked being absorbed into the very history they hoped to uncover. The most disturbing development came when modern genealogists, working through public ancestry databases, stumbled across family trees riddled with gaps. Entire branches ended without explanation. Cousins were listed, then crossed out. In one haunting instance, a family photo from the 1930s showed 6 smiling children. The caption named only 4. The other 2 had been erased not from the picture, but from memory itself. And still, the town thrived. Its perfection remained its strongest defense, a mask that made suspicion seem absurd to those who never looked closely. To the outside world, it was still a miracle of rural life. Only those who followed the trail of absences realized that perfection can sometimes hide a cost too terrible to name. The investigators had arrived. They had asked questions, gathered fragments, even glimpsed the shadow beneath the surface. But with each attempt, the same pattern repeated. Curiosity bred silence. Silence bred fear. And in the end, the town itself remained untouched, as though it was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. Which left the haunting question, how many more would it take before someone uncovered the truth completely? Or would the town, as it always had, consume the questioners before the answers ever saw the light? For decades, all anyone had were whispers. Fragments, rumors, half-remembered stories. But then came the archives. It started with a rumor among amateur researchers who had grown obsessed with the town's strange history. In 2011, a retired librarian named Harold Trent contacted an online forum devoted to unsolved mysteries. He claimed that, while working in the town's library during the 1970s, he had handled a series of boxes kept in the basement, files that were never catalogued, never available to the public. According to Trent, these boxes contained private records, once belonging to the Council of Elders, the families who had effectively governed the town for more than a century. Most dismissed his claims as the ramblings of an old man. But after Trent's death in 2012, his niece discovered a small trunk among his belongings. Inside were photocopies, fragments torn from ledgers, and a handful of letters. They were yellowed, faintly burned at the edges as though someone had tried to destroy them. And yet, even incomplete, they carried a weight that could not be ignored. One letter, dated 1894, was addressed to the town's first mayor. It spoke of a balance that must be maintained and referenced our agreement, bound by necessity, paid in flesh. Another, unsigned, noted, the circle was observed. The boy was chosen. The harvest will hold. But the most unsettling discovery was a ledger. In neat, practiced handwriting, it listed names beside dates. At first glance, it resembled an ordinary record book. But the column headings told a different story. Where one might expect to see births or deaths, the headings instead read, taken and gained. Under taken were names, many of which corresponded with families rumored to have disappeared. Under gained were assets, land, livestock, mills, bank accounts. The arithmetic was chillingly precise. Each absence was tallied against a material increase, as though life itself had been converted into currency. The ledger did not cover every disappearance. Entire years were blank, as if sections had been deliberately removed. But what remained was damning enough. A family vanishes, a farm changes hands. A boy disappears, the harvest that year surpasses expectation. A woman listed as taken in 1927, her husband appointed to the council the following spring. The pattern was unmistakable. When fragments of the ledger began circulating online, some insisted it was a forgery. But handwriting experts consulted by independent researchers declared the ink, paper, and style consistent with the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The ledger, they concluded, was genuine. And yet, its existence posed more questions than it answered. Who exactly was choosing the taken? Were the disappearances voluntary sacrifices, or forced removals? Did the council truly believe prosperity depended on these exchanges, or was it simply a mechanism of control cloaked in ritual language? One page hinted at something even darker. Scrawled in the margin, in a different hand, were the words, "The circle failed." Payment overdue. The entry beneath it recorded 3 names instead of 1. Their absence coincided with what other documents described as the hardest winter the town ever endured. The chilling suggestion was clear: if the cycle was not maintained, disaster followed. And so, more were taken. Among Trent's papers was also a map. It was crude, hand-drawn, but it marked several sites: the old well, the stone circle in the woods, and 2 barns that no longer existed. Each was labeled with a date, and next to some, initials. When cross-referenced against census records and obituaries, the dates matched years of reported disappearances. The initials matched surnames of the missing. The implication was unavoidable: these were the places where the rituals, or whatever passed for them, had occurred. Even more disturbing were the accounts from those who dared to visit the sites in modern times. Amateur investigators who ventured into the woods reported finding scorched patches of ground where nothing grew, as though fire had been set repeatedly in the same circle. Near the sealed well, one visitor claimed to hear a hollow knocking sound rising from the depths, though no one else was nearby. Skeptics dismissed these stories as hysteria or exaggeration. But for those who had seen the ledger, they fit all too well. The revelations tore apart any illusion of coincidence. For the first time, the disappearances could not be explained away as random tragedies. They were part of a system, meticulously recorded, measured, and repeated across generations. And yet, what terrified people most was how ordinary the record seemed. There was no overt talk of demons, no grand declarations of supernatural power. The language was bureaucratic, clinical. Taken. Gained. Balance held. It was the language of accounting, not mythology. Which raised the most unsettling possibility of all: perhaps the town's prosperity was not owed to forces beyond human control, but to deliberate human choices cloaked in ritual. But even if the rituals were human inventions, their consequences were real. Families gone. Properties absorbed. Prosperity maintained. The ledger reduced lives to numbers, sacrifices to transactions. It made the disappearances feel less like tragedies and more like cold, calculated entries in a centuries-old ledger of survival. When fragments of these discoveries began to circulate, the town reacted swiftly. Researchers reported their online posts vanishing, forums shutting down overnight, photographs mysteriously corrupted. Those who shared copies of the ledger received anonymous warnings. One message read simply, "You've seen enough." And then came the disappearances among the investigators themselves. A young archivist who claimed to have more pages from the ledger was last seen boarding a bus to the town. He never arrived. A pair of urban explorers who filmed the stone circle uploaded a teaser clip of their findings, only for their channel to go silent, the promised full video never appearing. The archives had not just revealed the past. They had awakened something in the present. For if the town had preserved its secrets this long, it was unlikely to stop now. Anyone who uncovered too much risked joining the ranks of the taken. Still, the existence of the ledger changed everything. For the first time, there was proof, tangible, undeniable, that the town's prosperity had a hidden cost. Proof that disappearances were not accidents, but part of a design. Proof that perfection was not natural, but purchased. And yet the biggest question remained, the one scrawled in shaky handwriting on the ledger's margin: what happens when the circle fails? Because if the town's survival truly depended on this grim arithmetic, then any break in the cycle would not just threaten its prosperity. It might unleash something far worse. It began with a festival. Every summer, the town held its annual celebration, an event polished for outsiders, designed to show off its charm. There were parades, craft stalls, live music, and children darting through streets strung with lanterns. Tourists flocked in, snapping photos of the old brick facades, sampling pies baked from heirloom recipes passed down through generations. It was, to all appearances, harmless. Picturesque. Perfect. But for those who knew the ledger, the festival carried an unnerving resonance. Nearly every major taking recorded in the archives had occurred in late summer, just after the harvest. The timing, the rituals, the gatherings, none of it was coincidence. It was a cycle, masked now by balloons and bunting. In 2015, one disappearance changed everything. Her name was Emily Hart, a 22-year-old graduate student visiting from out of state. She had come to the festival with two friends, charmed by its old-world aesthetic. She filmed herself laughing on the carousel, posted a photo of herself holding a paper lantern, and texted her mother that she would be home the following day. That was the last anyone outside the town ever heard from her. Witnesses recalled seeing her at the evening parade, standing near the old well that had long since been sealed and covered with flowers. She was talking to an elderly woman, described only as stern, dressed in black. When the parade ended, Emily's friends realized she was gone. At first, they assumed she had slipped away to meet someone or explore the festival on her own. But by midnight, when her phone went unanswered and her belongings remained untouched in her hotel room, panic set in. Her disappearance was reported the next morning. Police conducted searches, interviewed festival-goers, canvassed nearby fields. But no trace of Emily was found. Her phone was never recovered. Security footage from the festival mysteriously skipped during the hours she went missing. And though dozens of people had been standing near the well when she was last seen, not one claimed to notice her vanish. To outsiders, it was a baffling tragedy. To those who had studied the town's past, it was something else entirely. The ledger's last entry had been dated 1985. For 30 years, no new taking had been recorded, at least none anyone had discovered. But Emily's disappearance marked a return, a renewal. The cycle, it seemed, had not ended after all. The case attracted national media. Reporters descended on the town, eager to crack open its perfect facade. For the first time in living memory, the town was forced to confront scrutiny it had long avoided. Locals bristled at the attention, repeating the same lines. Emily must have left on her own, she was a troubled young woman, outsiders were stirring panic. But investigators uncovered inconsistencies. A farmer admitted seeing lights in the woods that night, flames rising in a circle. A teenage boy swore he heard singing carried on the wind, low and rhythmic, unlike any music from the festival. A waitress told reporters she overheard men at a diner whispering that the balance was restored. Within days, all three witnesses recanted, claiming they had been mistaken. The most chilling clue came from Emily's own camera. A memory card retrieved from her hotel showed dozens of cheerful photos, lanterns glowing, children dancing, fireworks bursting overhead. But the last image was different. It was blurry, tilted, as though taken in haste. In the frame stood the sealed well, its rim covered with flowers. Behind it loomed a cluster of figures in black robes, their faces obscured by hoods. Authorities dismissed the photo as a prank, perhaps staged by costumed festival-goers. But those who knew the ledger recognized the scene immediately. The well had been marked on the map. It had been used before. And now, it seemed, it was used again. Emily's friends, shattered by her disappearance, tried to pursue answers on their own. They shared her story online, pleading for help. Forums erupted with speculation, drawing connections between Emily and the ledger, the map, the old rumors. Amateur sleuths flooded the town, determined to uncover the truth. Some claimed to have found scorch marks in the woods, fresh and blackened as though from recent fires. Others insisted they saw strange gatherings at night, headlights forming a slow procession down forgotten backroads. But every attempt to dig deeper was met with resistance. Hotels turned away researchers, citing full bookings. Police detained investigators for trespassing, warning them to leave town. One blogger who claimed to have footage of a midnight ritual posted a teaser online, then vanished from the internet altogether. The sense of dread grew heavier with each passing month. Emily was never found, but something shifted in the town after her disappearance. Businesses boomed, crops flourished, property values soared. The economy surged as if infused with unnatural vigor. For the townsfolk, life went on, smoother than ever. But beneath the surface, the cost was clear. And then, whispers began again. A teacher's son gone missing for 2 days, suddenly reappearing with no memory of where he had been. A visiting salesman who checked into the inn but never checked out. His car remained parked outside, gathering dust, but no missing person report was ever filed. Each story was swallowed by the same refrain, outsiders exaggerating, children making up tales, nothing to worry about. But the pattern was undeniable. The cycle had been reawakened, and this time, it was no longer confined to old documents. It was happening in real time, before the eyes of those willing to see. Emily's mother never stopped searching. Every year she returned to the festival, handing out flyers, standing by the well with candles. Locals avoided her gaze, muttering that grief had driven her mad. But in the silence of their sidelong glances was something else, fear. Fear that if she probed too deeply, she might disturb the fragile balance once again. Her persistence, however, had an unintended effect. Outsiders began attending the festival not for charm, but for curiosity. Journalists, investigators, thrill-seekers, all came hoping to glimpse the truth. And with each arrival, the town tightened its grip. Surveillance increased. Access to archives was cut off. Roads were mysteriously blocked at night. The facade of perfection grew more desperate, more fragile, like a painting cracking under strain. The last disappearance had changed everything. It proved the ledger wasn't just history, it was prophecy. The town's perfection had never been natural. It had been purchased, again and again, with the lives of those chosen. And if Emily's fate proved anything, it was that the circle had not ended. It was alive, as merciless as ever. But the question lingered, if she was taken to restore balance, what would happen when the cycle faltered again? What price would the town demand next? The festival continued, year after year, a bright mask stretched over a dark ritual. Outsiders danced, laughed, and marveled at the perfection. But for those who knew the truth, every lantern lifted skyward, every bonfire lit in the square, felt like a quiet echo of something older, something that still demanded to be fed. And somewhere, buried beneath the flowers at the well, or in the ash circles deep in the woods, was Emily. Waiting. The town had always been careful. For more than a century, it had mastered the art of silence, burying what needed to be buried, masking every trace of blood with a smile and a pie cooling on a windowsill. Outsiders came and went, charmed by its quaint perfection. But the cracks, once opened, could no longer be plastered over. Emily Hart's disappearance had pulled at a loose thread, and now the entire fabric was unraveling. By 2018, a small team of independent investigators had dedicated themselves to the case. They weren't professionals, at least not in the traditional sense. One was a former journalist disgraced for chasing conspiracy stories. Another, a doctoral student obsessed with rural folklore. A third, Emily's mother herself, who refused to give up the search. Together, they returned to the town, under the guise of tourists, armed with cameras, drones, and copies of the ledger pages Harold Trent had preserved decades earlier. They knew they couldn't rely on local authorities. Police had stonewalled every request, refused every freedom of information filing, and warned them not to trespass. The council remained as untouchable as ever, smiling through press conferences, shaking hands at the festival, whispering in closed rooms where decisions were made. But secrecy has its limits. Patterns leave traces. Rituals leave marks. The breakthrough came not from a file, but from a sound. Late one night, as the group camped on the outskirts of the forest, they heard it, low voices, rhythmic, carrying on the still air. At first, it resembled a hymn, the kind sung in old churches. But there was no harmony, no warmth. Just the slow, repetitive chanting of syllables none of them recognized. The sound drew them deeper into the trees, flashlights cutting through the dark, until they saw it, a circle of fire burning in the clearing, figures gathered around it, their faces hidden beneath black hoods. At the center of the circle stood the old stone marker, the one Harold's map had labeled with a date and initials. But it wasn't just a stone, it was an altar. Dark stains marred its surface, seeping into cracks where moss refused to grow. And as the investigators watched from the tree lean, one of the hooded figures produced a bundle. It squirmed. It screamed. The group froze. It wasn't possible, surely not. But the cries were unmistakable, a child's voice, muffled by cloth. Emily's mother lunged forward, only to be dragged back by the journalist. They couldn't intervene, not yet. To reveal themselves would mean vanishing like so many before. So they filmed. Every moment, every chant, every flicker of fire. And then, as if sensing they were being watched, the hooded figures stopped. The fire hissed low. Silence fell. One by one, the figures turned their heads toward the trees. Straight toward the investigators. The group fled, crashing through branches, stumbling in the dark until they collapsed on the edge of the road. By the time they dared look back, the clearing was empty. The fire extinguished. The altar bare. Only the echo of chanting lingered, carried on the wind. When they reviewed the footage later, their terror deepened. The camera had captured the circle of hooded figures, the flames, the altar. But when it panned toward the bundle, the image glitched. Static tore across the frame, distorting the shapes until the bundle was gone. And though the cries had echoed in their ears, the audio track contained nothing but silence. It was proof and yet not proof. Evidence that resisted being held. Just like everything else in the town. But they had seen enough to know, the ledger wasn't history. It was alive, continuing, adapting. The perfect prosperity wasn't luck, nor inheritance, nor divine blessing. It was bought, as it had always been, with flesh and silence. The group pressed further. They discovered tunnels beneath the town, remnants of Prohibition-era smuggling routes, long forgotten on official maps. These passages connected the church basement to the library's sealed archives, to the very well where Emily had last been seen. Deep underground, graffiti marked the walls, circles, runes, and names carved in jagged lines. Some were dates. Some were pleas. Help me. Taken. Balance. And in the deepest chamber, hidden behind a rusted door, they found bones. Not a few, but piles, small skulls, femurs, ribs stacked neatly as though catalogued. Each set marked with symbols, chalked in faded lines. Some were too old to date without testing. Others, chillingly, still bore scraps of fabric, colors recognizable even decades later. A child's shoe. A woman's scarf. Emily's mother collapsed at the sight, her hands trembling as she sifted through the remnants, praying to find something, anything, that proved her daughter had not met the same fate. But the pile offered no names, no certainty. Only silence. The journalist wanted to take photos, to upload them immediately. But when he raised his camera, the batteries died, one after another. The doctoral student tried recording audio, only for the files to corrupt. It was as though the chamber itself rejected exposure, resisting the outside world. Still, they had their memories, and those could not be erased. They knew, finally and without doubt, what the town had buried beneath its perfection. The decision came quickly. They would confront the council. Not in secret, not in whispers, but openly. On the final night of the festival, they stormed the town hall, dragging the ledger pages, the fragments of bone, the copies of Harold's letters. The townsfolk, gathered for the closing ceremony, watched in stunned silence as the investigators shouted their accusations. Names were called. Dates recited. Properties traced from taken families to sitting council members. The mask cracked under the weight of revelation. But then, something unexpected happened. No one denied it. Not a single council member shouted them down. Instead, one of the elders, a frail man with trembling hands, rose slowly from his chair. He looked out at the crowd, at the tourists and townsfolk, at Emily's mother clutching a child's shoe, and he spoke, "You don't understand. You never understood. Without the balance, we would have starved 100 years ago. Without it, we will starve again. This is the cost. It has always been the cost." The hall erupted into chaos. Some shouted in horror, others wept, still others nodded grimly as though confirming what they had always known. The investigators demanded arrests, demanded justice. But the police never moved. They stood still, hands at their sides, eyes lowered. And then, the lights went out. The building plunged into darkness. Screams filled the air. Somewhere in the blackness, the chanting began again, soft, steady, rising from every corner. The investigators tried to push through the crowd, but hands grasped at them, pulling, dragging. Emily's mother screamed her daughter's name. The journalist swung wildly with his camera. The doctoral student shouted for someone, anyone, to record this. When the lights returned, the investigators were gone. Vanished, as though swallowed whole. The council stood in silence at the front of the hall. No explanation offered, none needed. The festival ended without further word. The tourists left the next morning, shaken but unwilling to question what they had seen. The townsfolk resumed their lives, businesses booming, children laughing, gardens blooming in perfect symmetry. The mask of perfection had slipped, but only for a moment. Just long enough to reveal the abyss beneath. And then, like always, it sealed shut again. But somewhere, beneath the town, in the tunnels and chambers filled with bones, the truth remained. Waiting for the next curious soul to pry too deeply. Waiting for the next balance to be paid. Perfection. It's a word people chase their whole lives, a dream painted on postcards, sold in real estate brochures, whispered in promises of the good life. But in this town, perfection was never a gift. It was a bargain. And bargains, by their nature, demand payment. Today, if you drive down its streets, you'll see nothing unusual. Children laughing in manicured parks. Families shopping at corner stores. Couples sipping coffee outside brickfront cafes. The gardens bloom just as they always have. The houses shine in perfect rows. The air smells faintly of cinnamon, sweet and inviting. To an outsider, it's everything you could want. A place untouched by chaos, frozen in time like a photograph of the American dream. But for those who know the truth, every smile looks like a mask. Every cheerful hello sounds rehearsed. Every festival lantern glows like a reminder of lives extinguished to keep the town alight. Because beneath the perfection lies a century of silence, a ledger of flesh and fear. The story of Emily Hart still haunts the town. Officially, she is listed as missing, presumed dead. Her case remains unsolved, her photograph tucked away in faded news archives. Tourists who pass through never see her face, never hear her name. Yet for those who whisper in hushed tones, her presence lingers. At night, some claim they hear a young woman's voice near the sealed well, crying for help that will never come. Others say her reflection sometimes appears in store windows, not as she was, but as something older, hollow-eyed, and waiting. The investigators who vanished during the festival are remembered only by their families, who still beg for answers that never arrive. Online threads about them go dark, posts deleted, videos corrupted. The internet has a way of preserving memory, but here, even memory is silenced. As if the town itself refuses to be seen. And yet, prosperity continues. Businesses flourish. Crops grow fuller than the land should allow. Children succeed in school at rates far above the national average. Some call it luck. Some call it tradition. But those who have read the ledger, those who have walked the tunnels beneath the church, know better. They know prosperity was never free. Still, questions remain. Was it all ritual, or was ritual only an excuse? Did the town truly believe in a supernatural balance, or did powerful families invent the myth to justify their control? Were the taken sacrificed to an unseen force, or simply eliminated to preserve an illusion of order? The answers may never be known. The council denies nothing because it never needs to. Silence, after all, is its strongest weapon. And silence has worked. The town remains. Outsiders forget. Each generation grows up believing theirs is the happiest place on earth. And perhaps, in their eyes, it is. For those who benefit, perfection feels real. Only those who vanish, and those who remember them, know the cost. Sometimes, late at night, when the festivals are over and the streets lie empty, locals speak of the circle. They say it still burns in the woods, faint and low, the ground forever scorched in its shape. They say if you listen closely, you can hear voices chanting in the distance, soft, steady, promising the balance will hold. Most deny it, laughing nervously, insisting they've heard nothing. But in their eyes, a flicker betrays them. The truth is simple, and terrible, the cycle continues. The ledger may never be updated on paper again, but the arithmetic remains. Someone will always be taken. Someone will always pay. And perhaps that's why the town still thrives when others falter. Perhaps that's why its fields never fail, why its families never fracture, why its streets remain spotless year after year. The town may not be cursed, it may simply be efficient. Perfection bought with silence. For outsiders, the choice is yours. You can dismiss this story as superstition, a dark folktale born from coincidence and paranoia. You can convince yourself that Emily Hart simply wandered off, that the investigators made mistakes, that the bones in the tunnels belonged to forgotten cattle or staged pranks. You can choose to believe, as most do, that there is no ledger, no circle, no bargain. Or, you can look closer. You can trace the property records, match the names, follow the patterns. You can visit the festival and stand by the well at midnight. You can listen for the chanting in the woods. And if you do, you may find the truth for yourself. But beware. Because truth has a cost. Curiosity has a cost. And in this town, the cost is always the same. So the next time you see a place that looks too perfect, too flawless, too untouched by time, remember this story. Remember the ledger. Remember the names written under, taken. And ask yourself, what was traded so that the gardens could bloom, the houses could shine, the children could laugh without fear? Perfection is never free. Someone always pays. And in this town, someone always will.